Disclaimer: this podcast is purely made for educational purposes and does not endorse any political or ideological viewpoints. All information provided here, unless explicitly stated as opinions, have been researched from open source knowledge. This episode in particular also discusses certain incidents and situations of violence and extremism which may trigger strong emotions. So, listener discretion is advised. AJ's Alternate History podcast does not bear any responsibility for the misinterpretation of the contents furnished in this podcast for promotion of conflict of any sorts. Thank you and hope you have a great time listening to AJ's Alternate History podcast and learning history from a new perspective. Today's episode is set on the morning of September the 11th, 2001 in Lower Manhattan, New York, USA. The entire nation of USA wakes up to a horrifying news. No, it is not the news that a group of terrorists have hijacked a bunch of aeroplanes and crashed them at vital landmarks. No. Then, what kind of news is this country waking up to? So, what the Americans wake up to in the reality is that the FBI and New York Police Department had thwarted a major terror plot. Newspapers and primetime news shows on television publish screamer headlines. Massive terror plot, 19 arrested in connection with massive 9/11 attack. Later that day, the senators of the opposition Democratic Party raised scathing questions at President George W. Bush and other office bearers. How come such vast number of terrorists entered the USA at the first place? Welcome to another episode of AJ's Alternate History podcast. I am your friendly historian Arjun, and in this episode, we shall try to prevent the loss of around 3,000 lives which were lost during the 9/11 terrorist attack. Without much ado, let's jump right into today's episode. Before we jump on to preventing this situation, we need to understand what exactly happened. So, to recap to our listeners, on September the 11th, 2001, 19 terrorists belonging to the Al-Qaeda terrorist group, an Islamist fundamentalist terror organization again, hijacked 4 American airlines on a coast-to-coast flight and sought to crash them across the nation's various key locations, including the World Trade Center in Lower Manhattan, New York City, the Pentagon in Arlington, Virginia, and another unspecified target, possibly the Capitol Hill or the White House in Washington, D.C. 3 of the 4 planes struck their intended targets, whilst the 4th aircraft, which was headed towards Washington, had abruptly crashed into an empty plot in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, when the passengers learnt of the motive and wrestled the aircraft out of the terrorists' control. On that unfortunate day, 2,977 innocent lives were lost because of the terror attack, and left behind an entire nation sitting in disbelief and shock as to what happened and on the verge of fighting an unending war. Whether one likes the USA or not, this attack certainly brought together the world to mourn the loss of lives at such large magnitude. One can only imagine how the world would have looked if this attack would have been prevented. Personally, I've been obsessed over this for over a year now. 9/11 simply wasn't just a group of terrorists hijacking a bunch of aircraft and crashing at various key landmarks. More or less, if such an attack would have been thwarted at the first place, it is very likely that the terrorists would have come back and plotted a similar or a much more devastating attack in the years to follow. Before we try and come up with alternate timelines where, the 9/11 terror plot is busted or, is prevented at the last moment, we need to understand what kind of events transpired towards this plot at the first place. Of the many questions that have been lingering in my mind regarding 9/11, one of the major questions is, could the law enforcement agencies have thwarted the attack at the first place? Did they have the necessary intelligence to do so? And to answer this question alone is a very difficult task. We also need to answer a few further set of sub questions, which would sound something like, what was the motive behind the 9/11 terror attack? Was the US intelligence even aware of such a looming attack? And if so, since when have they been aware of this, and what kind of knowledge do they have about this, and what precautionary measures have they taken towards at least trying to prevent this from happening? In this episode, we will look at the circumstances which led to the terror attacks and further delve into an alternate timeline in the future episodes, as I believe that this episode is going to be very long, as there is a lot of context which has to be gained before we come up with alternate scenarios. So let's get right into this. I believe that there is more to this attack than what most people know or speak of. So, in my understanding, 9/11 in itself isn't a standalone attack, meaning that it had been executed after careful planning and much after the failed previous attempts. Now, what does this mean? On February the 26th of 1993, at 12:18 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, a 590 kilogram or a 1,310 pound car bomb exploded in one of the four garages of the World Trade Center's basement, rocking the entire building, and during which 6 innocent lives were lost and over 1,000 people were injured. The FBI soon swung into action and started to identify its perpetrators. They identified an individual called Ramzi Youssef, a person of Pakistani origin. Immediately after the bombing, Ramzi Youssef emigrated back to Pakistan, from where he continued plotting multiple other terrorist attacks. Some examples of the kind of work which he did include the Philippines Air Flight 434 and the bombing of the Imam Reza Shrine in Tehran, both of which occurred in the following year of 1994 itself. The FBI, who by this time were on the manhunt for Ramzi Youssef, were gradually receiving intelligence about his activities across the globe. On 6th of January 1995, the Manila Police Department, who came to investigate an unnatural fire at an apartment suite, discovered what are known as the plans for the Bujinka plot. The Bujinka plot aimed not only to assassinate the then Pope of the Vatican Church, John Paul II, who was, by the way, was planning to tour Manila on 15th of January 1995, but also to explode a dozen. There was also an alleged plot to crash an airliner into the CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. What would have happened if this Bujinka plot succeeded, or anything of that sort kind of happened at the first place, is a topic for a deeper discussion, and which I will probably cover in another of our following episodes. Ramzi Youssef eventually was arrested in Islamabad, Pakistan, in a joint operation between the Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence (ISI) and the US Diplomatic Security Service on February the 7th, 1995. He was soon extradited to the United States for further trials and was sentenced to life imprisonment plus an extended sentence of 240 years, which in all had to be spent in solitary confinement, considering all the terror attacks he had previously committed. Louis Chiliro, who was the director of one of the field offices in New York City, 1998 to 2000, of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, later stated that whilst ferrying Ramzi Youssef over the New York City on one clear night during January of 1996, one of the FBI officers took permission from Louis and removed the blindfold of Ramzi's eyes as they were flying adjacent to the World Trade Center, when the FBI agent nudged Youssef and stated that, "You see there, it is still standing." Youssef, with a certain and confident look on his face, responded that it would have not been standing if we had more funding. Now, what did Ramzi Youssef mean when he said we? The United States intelligence speculated already that Ramzi Youssef had links to Osama bin Laden and the Al-Qaeda based on documents seized from his fellow accomplice and terrorist Hamad Ajaz, one of which bore the title Al-Qaeda on it. The FBI also claims that during his stay in the United States, Ramzi Youssef had made several phone calls to international numbers on his cell phone, one of which is or was allegedly that of Osama bin Laden's number. However, the 9/11 Commission report suggests that during the interrogation of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed in 2004, the latter claimed that Ramzi Youssef had no links with Al-Qaeda. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed is the maternal uncle of Ramzi Youssef and an Al-Qaeda associate, who was also allegedly the member of the 1993 Bojinka plot and certainly the mastermind of the 9/11 terrorist attack itself. Osama bin Laden was the leader of the Islamic terror organization called Al-Qaeda. But what is Al-Qaeda? Al-Qaeda is one of the Mujahideen organizations founded in the waning years of the Soviet-Afghan War of the 1980s. After witnessing the massive success in Afghanistan, Osama bin Laden returned to Saudi Arabia and used his success in the war to raise awareness about the noble cause he was working towards. That is to simply wage jihad or holy war against the enemies of the Muslims. Al-Qaeda was apparently founded in the year 1988 and had also began to expand their operations globally. They started exporting their modules to other regions where they felt that Muslims were under threat from non-Muslim aggression, such as Bosnia and Chechnya. Just as the war in Afghanistan turned the young and inexperienced fighters into well-trained, well-organized group of veterans who specialized in guerrilla warfare, there were new clouds of war looming over the Middle East once again. Osama bin Laden sought to utilize this opportunity and wage another jihad, this time for the defense of Saudi Arabia, the holy land of the Muslims, home of the Mecca and Medina shrines. And who was the enemy? It was Saddam Hussein and the Iraqi military. However, when Osama bin Laden approached a certain members of the Saudi aristocracy, he was denied the permission to carry out his jihad against Iraq. Apparently, the then Saudi Minister for Defense and Aviation, Sultan bin Abdulaziz Al Saud, allegedly responded to Osama bin Laden's request by stating that there are no caves in Kuwait. What will you do when Saddam Hussein lobs missiles at you with chemical and biological weapons? To which Osama bin Laden allegedly responded by stating that we will fight with our faith. Eventually, Osama's request was denied and instead Americans were called in to protect Saudi Arabia, which not only infuriated him, but he also apparently got to know that the decision to call in the Americans was taken much before he had made his move, which again infuriated him further. As he continued to protest against the Saudi government's decision to call in the Americans, the Saudis decided to confiscate his passport and expel him out of the kingdom. Bin Laden eventually ended up in Sudan by 1992. Bin Laden began plotting revenge against the Americans. Before 9/11, the Clinton administration's presidential findings allowed the CIA to only conduct reconnaissance operations and take photographs of suspected terrorists and threats to national security, but not to engage in lethal direct action against them. Keeping this in mind, as we would be reverting to this point later and understand as to what kind of impact and implication it would have on the preemption of 9/11 attack, let's just move on and discuss what happened in Sudan itself. During one of the reconnaissance operations in Sudan itself, it was clearly determined that bin Laden was on the verge of becoming a massive threat to the United States national security, and that the CIA station in Sudan proposed to assassinate bin Laden. However, the Clinton administration denied the permission to do so, and all plans were scratched. Osama bin Laden, by the way, remained in Sudan sometime up until 1996 and eventually moved to Afghanistan. The rationale behind the decision to not assassinate Osama bin Laden was both at a political and policy levels, was the kind of a perception that he had in minds of the politicians sitting in Washington DC. To elucidate this, let us see how one of the former US diplomats, Philip C. Wilcox Jr., responded to Osama bin Laden's call for jihad against USA in 1997. He is a major terrorist financier with a large fortune of his own. He has been a major financial sponsor of Islamic terror. With a large fortune of his own, he has bankrolled terrorist groups and individuals all over the world. And this is what comes from one of US's leading diplomats of that time. The US government had a very limited definition of the role of bin Laden even after the FBI linked the 1993 World Trade Center bombings to him. This perception of him lasted until 9/11. What also amplified this rhetoric was the fact that many senior intelligence officials shared the same view regarding bin Laden as their political and policymaker counterparts did in Washington, D.C. However, at ground level, the US intelligence reports suggested something different altogether and something which was way more alarming. The CIA, understanding the gravity of the situation, established the Bin Laden Issue Station in 1996, also known as Alex Station. This unit was dedicated towards tracking down Bin Laden and his associates and their activities and finding ways to apprehend him and put him in trial or on trial over terrorism charges either in the USA or an Islamic country which was friendly to the US, something preferably like Saudi Arabia. Lesser known details which have subsequently been revealed through publication of various biographies and compilations of testimonials from former officials of the CIA's Mission Center for Counterterrorism, an amalgamated unit of officers from the CIA, the FBI, the National Security Agency, the NSA, and the DIA, that is the Defense Intelligence Agency, however, paint a different picture altogether. The FBI and the CIA were in pursuit of bin Laden since the late 80s. The biographies and testaments, especially that of former director of the CIA, George Tenet in particular, states that the Counterterrorism Center or CTC was aware that bin Laden was planning to conduct massive terror operations in the USA since 1996, when two Al Qaeda officials defected to US Embassy in East Africa. These also suggest that the CIA was actually planning to assassinate bin Laden since 1998, but the way things were progressing weren't fast enough to eliminate him before the 9/11 attacks happened. Bin Laden had clearly been signaling the Americans all along. His first fatwa came in 1995, followed by another one in 1997. Now, to demonstrate what he called for, he orchestrated a series of high-profile terrorist attacks outside mainland US. the first of which being the 1992 hotel bombings in Aden, Yemen. Al-Qaeda targeted US soldiers who were transiting to Somalia for humanitarian work. Fortunately, no US soldiers were killed in that attack. On November the 13th, 1996, Al-Qaeda terrorists planted a 300-pound explosive near the headquarters of the Office of the Program Manager of the Saudi Arabian National Guard, headquartered in downtown Riyadh. 7 people were killed in the explosion, 5 of whom belonged to the US Army. On the night of June the 25th, 1996, Al-Qaeda exploded a bomb near the Khobar Tower housing complex in Dhahran, Saudi Arabia, killing 19 USAF personnel, injuring more than 400 military personnel and civilians. On August the 7th of 1998, simultaneous bomb blasts occurred outside US embassies at Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, and Nairobi, Kenya, killing 224 and injuring over 4,000. Probably the most dangerous of all and the most overt was the attack that occurred on October the 12th, 2000, when Al-Qaeda militants rammed a speedboat laden with explosives at the missile destroyer USS Cole, killing 17 US servicemen and damaging the ship. This, of course, occurred off the coast of Yemen. What is interesting is that during the 1997 interview with CNN, of course, the same which we mentioned earlier, to which one of the US diplomats again responded to Osama bin Laden's jihad call, the following conversation occurred between the CNN reporter and bin Laden. The reporter asks, is the jihad directed against the US government or the United States troops in Arabia? What about the US civilians in Arabia? And what about the people of the United States? Bin Laden responded, we, that is Al-Qaeda, have focused our declaration of jihad on striking at the US soldiers inside Arabia, the country of the two holy places, Mecca and Medina. In our religion, it is not permitted for any non-Muslims to stay in Arabia. Therefore, even though American civilians are not targeted in our plan, they must leave. We do not guarantee their safety. Throughout the entire duration of researching for this episode, several key questions have been lingering my mind. The biggest of which being, why couldn't the CTC prevent 9/11 if they knew that such an attack was impending on the US? And also, on an alternate timeline, what could have happened if Al-Qaeda was allowed to conduct jihad against Iraq in 1990? Whilst my research still continues, in speculating the outcomes of this diversions, I would have to put an end to this episode, which I believe would have provided some context behind why things happened the way they did. To know the answers to the impending loopholes in this chronology, don't forget to subscribe to AJ's Alternate History podcast on your favorite streaming platform. And also, don't forget to check out our social media handles. Until then, this is your friendly historian, Arjun, signing off. Tata, bye-bye.